My name is David Dunware, and I serve as the campaign director for Better Tech for Tomorrow. And there's a lot of great, interesting things we're working on, and Texas really being at the intersection of so many of the emerging technology issues. It's not serendipity that we're doing this, but it's by design. TBPF, of course, our mission to make Texas and America the freest places on earth. We're clearly at a point where technology is inextricably bound to every policy area that we are touching. And today, the panel is on artificial intelligence in the Texas future. And by way of introducing that panel, I want to take a second to outline what our vision is at TBPF, and then we'll get into what I would say, and not even out of bias, is perhaps one of the most important discussions on artificial intelligence, given the panelists we have here, and given the prominent role Texas will play in shaping AI, both in the private sector application, but then also in being a model state for policy. So the two parts of the vision that I think about every day when I wake up and walk into 901 Congress is first, that Texas not should, but must maintain its dominance at the tip of the spear in technological innovation. And that's important for a number of reasons, particularly in AI, because as we see on so many other issues, the federal government continues to abdicate its responsibility on border security, on kid safety, and as we'll hear today, in many respects, on artificial intelligence. So barring action from them, we have, of course, this international race playing out for AI supremacy, whatever you want to call it. States are stepping up and leading in the AI space, and really the way I see it, I hail from Sacramento, California, so you can say thank you for me being exported here to not repeat what's been happening there. It's Texas versus California is the way I see it. And Texas, its values, its entrepreneurs, the spirit, and all the policy that goes into it will shape and can shape AI as a force multiplier for good. And in California, the story I tell when we're talking about the technocrats, so a lot of people ask, what does that even mean? I think of co-founder of Google, Larry Page, when he talks about humanity being a threat to AI innovation and development. And for those of you that may have read Musk's book, there's a story about this where Larry Page accuses Elon Musk of being speciest because in Texas, where he resides, we promote humanity and understand that AI should be that force multiplier to augment what we do well. Now, the second piece, so Texas must maintain its dominance. The second piece, we do that through policy by erecting guardrails, responsible oversight, this notion that technology should serve humanity and lift us up and propel us forward, like so many of the other epics we've had in history, whether it's the horse and buggy to automobile, today artificial intelligence. We want policy to guide that forward and shepherd it so we do, again, end up at the tip of the spear responsibly. So the piece I want to say to kind of frame this discussion, and I was told to be slightly provocative for this, so hopefully this tees up some good discussion. I would contend that AI poses civilizational implications. And technology, I think all of us on the stage here understand technology is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or it can be used for harm. And there's myriad dichotomies you could play out here. One of the things that I think about when we're talking about deep fakes and how AI can be used to create sexualized content of underage girls, ruining them, robbing them of their innocence, but that same technology can also be used to restore home videos that have perhaps been corrupted and bring back nostalgic memories. And I could go down the list of counterpoints on this. And so the civilizational implication, where we're at right now, I like to think of Texas as at the tip of the digital frontier, because that's really where we're at. And instead of the spirit of 1836, where it was telling Santa Anna to pound sand and to come and take it, I say in Texas, we tell the technocrats in California to come and take it, because Texas will lead, will continue to lead, and it's with that this is going to be an optimistic discussion, I believe, because we have some great minds, some folks who have been leading in this issue for years, and with that, I will hastily unzip this folder I should have prior to this and introduce our panelists. So immediately to my left is Senator Tan Parker. Now, Senator Tan Parker, I recently had the chance of meeting, and he's been working with the foundation on so many crucial issues for, years now. And he's a businessman. He grew up in North Texas, working in his family's restaurants while volunteering in his community. And he married his college sweetheart, Beth, and they moved to Flower Mound, raising their daughters, Lauren and Ashley. He currently represents Senate District 12. That's the 4 parts of counties in North Texas. and previously served in the Texas House of Representatives, where you were unanimously elected in the 84th and 85th legislature as chair of the House Republican Caucus. And I would ad-lib that he has been a stalwart and a champion on so many important technology issues, whether it's blockchain and ensuring that our financial systems are not taken away from us and we rescind our control, or artificial intelligence. We'll talk about House Bill 2060, which you carried in the Senate. So please join me in welcoming our first panelist, Senator Tan Parker.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Good to be with you. Good to see you. Thank you.
And then to our senators left, we have Suhail Khan. And Suhail was connected to me by a fun conservative stalwart, a good friend of ours, J.B. Horton. And Suhail he's worn a lot of hats in his career, and he currently serves as the Senior Director of External Affairs at Microsoft. And he, in prior life, served as policy advisor and counsel on Capitol Hill, and as a senior political appointee with the Bush administration, where he served in the White House and as an advisor for 2 cabinet secretaries. I think this is really important. In addition to your political efforts, Suhail, you have been very involved as a passionate advocate for religious freedom in the United States, around the globe, in places like China, Vietnam, Europe, and throughout the Middle East. My colleague Zach Whiting's in here somewhere. There you are. So he told me I had to add that he is an alumnus of University of Iowa, where he received his law degree. So please join me in welcoming Suhail. Great. Well, to the left of Suhail, Chairman Giovanni Capriglione. So Chairman Giovanni has been serving the Texas House in House District 98 since 2012, so on your 6th term. And he currently serves as chairman of the House Committee on Pensions, Investments, and Financial Services. And germane to this discussion, chairman of the Innovation and Technology Caucus, where we'll talk about some of the exciting things happening there as recently as today, actually. And he's noted as a national leader on so many crucial technology issues. In fact, about this time last year, we had Chairman Capriglione in to talk about House Bill 4, the strongest consumer data privacy bill in the country, which through his hard work and many others is now law of the land and signed into law. And a whole host of other cybersecurity issues. Chairman Giovanni has been recognized by folks across the country as the man on tech, so to speak. So please join me in welcoming Chairman Capriglione. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Mark Stone joining us. Dr. Mark Stone currently serves as the System Chief Information Officer for the Texas A&M University System, which I was hastened by my Longhorn friends to remind the audience is the 2nd largest university system in Texas. But in this role, tremendous responsibilities, especially the digital vanguard here. He is responsible for cybersecurity, enterprise-wide applications, networking, infrastructure strategy development, all throughout the Texas A&M system. And a recent congratulatory remark to Dr. Stone, he was appointed by Governor Greg Abbott to serve on the Artificial Intelligence Advisory Council, which we'll talk about today, as the ethicist exploring a lot of the ethical questions undergirding AI's use in state agencies. He has a truly impressive background educationally as well. Baylor University for undergrad, received his master's in divinity, master's in theology from Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and finally a PhD in ethics from Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary as well. So please join me in welcoming all of our panelists here for the AI discussion. Okay, well, we kind of talked about how we wanted to do this beforehand, and we'll stick to that. I do want to note that this morning there's a lot of exciting political announcements, one of which was the Artificial Intelligence Advisory Council's meeting, so we'll get into that. But I want to do a bit of a pulse check here. Audience, please raise your hand. How many of you would say you're following artificial intelligence closely or very closely? Okay, that's about right. Now, for the folks who aren't raising their hand, or for the folks who may not be fully aware of what's going on, Suhail, you've got quite the gift in explaining what this convoluted technology is that is AI. So can you kick us off, set the table? What is AI? What are we talking about in this panel?
Sure. Well, thanks, David, and thanks to all of you. Really grateful to be here, particularly with this really esteemed panel, and grateful to all of you for making the choice. I know you have other options It's kind of like the flight attendants. You have other options to be here. You have other panels you could have come to, and I'm glad you chose this one. So hopefully we'll live up to the introduction that David so kindly gave all of us. So kind of what the question is so important, you know, what brings us to what we're talking about right now? What exactly is AI? And, you know, why are we having this conversation? Why do some folks have some real concerns that they should? You know, what I tell people is this, about this time of year, last year, three forces came together to kind of create what we are now calling generative AI. The first is the ability to make massive computations in a very speedy and very quick amount of time, talking about seconds. Now, you take that for granted for those of you who, you know, have used search, but we're talking about massive computations of massive amounts of data. So the first is that there is this ability now to make these massive computations, and that is very specific. And, you know, David mentioned that I'm an Iowa alum. We have one server that does this computation, and it happens to be in Iowa, right? And even Facebook, and I know I have a partner here from Facebook. Facebook partners with Microsoft because they want to use that particular computational, you know, facility that we have in Iowa. So the first thing is that computational power. The second is something that we also might take for granted, and that is the vast amount of human information, of knowledge, human knowledge, has now been digitized, right? We're not talking about just news sources or media sources, but we're talking about even ancient Latin texts and other types of much more arcane, you know, information documents has now been digitized. And the third thing, which brings us to this moment, which is an important pivotal moment, is that there is now a software, and sometimes you hear this in the news, and those in the tech world talk about it often, LLM, large language model software, which is able to, using that facility, compute all of that data to create a very unique, bespoke response to a query that an individual is making using that software. So those are the three things that have come together. They came together pretty much early last year, and many of you heard the term ChatGPT, and that was because a company called OpenAI out of California, 50 employees, was doing this research, trying to develop this software, this large language model software. They came to Microsoft a few years ago. They said, we don't have this computational power. Can we use your facility to engage in this research? We gave them credits, and they burned through those credits doing this research. They came back to us and said, hey, we want to keep going, but we run out of the credit that you gave us to use your you know, this facility without having to pay you cash. We said, let's look at your work. We looked at it. We said, nah, we're not that impressed. They said, okay, fine. They went to Google. Google has one of these facilities. They went through several iterations of research with Google. They burned through those. They didn't like working with Google. They came back to us and said, hey, we've done some work. We've made some progress. We want to use your facility. We said, let's look at your work again. We looked at it and said, okay, actually, this is pretty promising. We gave them more credit, made more investments in OpenAI, and they came up with the large language model. And at that point, we entered into a formal agreement with them, a partnership with them, and they are a nonprofit, by the way. And we engaged in this agreement, and that's what you saw around Christmas time, 2023, last year, suddenly headlines saying, hey, this generative AI that we've been talking about is now out there, and it's usable and it's functional. Because I will say this, and I'll pause, you've been using AI for years whether you knew it or not, right? If you took an Uber over here, or if you drove over here and you use GPS, you've been using AI. If you have an iPhone like I do and you use your thumb or your facial recognition technology to unlock it rather than entering your code each time, that's AI. If you're, you know, we're not supposed to text while we're driving, if you're using voice to text, that's AI. So we've been using AI, and AI has been around for 60, 70 years, and it's gotten better and better. But this moment that we're talking about right now is generative AI, where again, you as a consumer and others in research and other areas around our country and indeed around the globe are able to put in very specific queries. Because before, this is not search. If you went on Bing or Google or other search engines and you would say, hey, what's the best barbecue in Austin? And you would get 16, 17 links, and you say, okay, honey, you click on those and you look and you figure out, let's go to Franklin's tonight and stand in line and try to get their brisket, which of course you can't do that for dinner, you have to go in the morning. But that's how you kind of do that research project, which is search. We're not talking about that here. What we're talking about here is where you put in a prompt in, let's say, Bing Chat, and you ask, I want you to write a comprehensive memo on a particular topic, let's say what's happening today in Texas, the Texas State Legislature on the issue of technology. I want you to put specific headings in there about privacy. I want you to write and highlight specific lawmakers who are champions of this issue, and I want you to talk about some of the dangers and the promise of the technology, and I want you to write it in 10 pages. And it goes through in a matter of seconds, using that software that I described, using that particular server in Iowa, and then coming up with a very specific answer for your question that, by the way, with Microsoft is tied to the internet, as I mentioned with Bing, and therefore, when you ask it a question today on this afternoon, Thursday afternoon, you'll get a different answer tomorrow because things might have changed, right? Because it's going through all those news sources, all that academic research that's out there, and what other types of sources that are available that are relevant to your question. So I just wanted to kind of do some table setting there. I'm sure we're going to get into some very important questions, including safety, privacy, and then the big thing that I'm passionate about is bias. You guys have heard the stories about bias, particularly bias against conservatives, and that's real, and I want to talk about that perhaps in the Q&A.
Thank you, Zuhail. You mentioned the timeline, and part of it is, of course, we talk about the demystification of AI. It's been around for quite some time, but it really started hitting the masses in the mainstream during 2023. Now, Chairman Capriglione and Senator Parker, you both were well ahead of the headlines in authoring and working on House Bill 2060. And I'd love kind of just open-ended we'll start with Senator Parker. What was kind of the thought process on looking at legislation on AI last session? And if you want to talk about House Bill 2060, I'll leave it to both of you to cover that.
Absolutely. Well, it's wonderful to be with all of you. So many great friends in the room. Thank you all for coming to the session. And look, what we did with regard to this bill, 2060, is very similar to the way we've tackled other major topics through the years I've been blessed to carry legislation on. If you don't know where you're going, you can't lead. And so, you threw back to history a moment ago with 1836. I was blessed years ago to work to create the 1836 project. And so that same passion that is in all of us as Texans, we need to take to the AI battlefield. But what we did specifically with this bill is to really put in place experts, is what we wanted to do. We want to put experts in the room to be able to study the topic. And so we started today. I chaired our hearing today. Gio and I will alternate meetings. We'll have meetings over the course of the entire year. Today we started with state agencies. So we went through 4 state agencies today, breaking down what they're doing with AI today, where it's appropriate for usage, where it's not. And so through that process and through the process of additional agencies and through open testimony, we're going to allow the public at large, we want the public at large, to inform us. Obviously, so many of the greatest minds on the topic are in the private sector, and we want to hear from you. And so that's an open call to follow what we're doing. We have a website that's now up that will keep track of our meetings and talk about when our next meeting is going to be occurring. And again, we want to encourage public testimony. But the belief is we'll take the byproduct, if you will, of all of this discussion, all of this testimony, and then we'll put in place ultimately a summary document that Representative Capriglione and I want to get accomplished at the latter part of November, December, prior to the next session. And so that document will be then disseminated to the public at large, obviously to all of our colleagues in the legislature, to the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker. And from there, it will drive policy decisions. So today, in the 3+ hours that I was blessed to lead the committee today, we probably, I want the other colleagues' feedback on this, there are probably no less than 7 to 8, at least, maybe 10 or more bill ideas that came out of the conversation this morning already. So there's a whole lot that will come through this process. It's the beginning of the journey. But again, my fundamental guiding light as a lawmaker is to first do no harm. Yes, I want to always be the state that leads for creativity and ingenuity. I believe that the real opportunities for this country are in the states. I believe passionately in federalism. D.C. is a broken national capital, and the opportunities to advance this country all come from the states. And so that's the reason why I want to lead on these areas. That's why I've been blessed to carry legislation leading in areas such as the medical world with what we did years ago. I see some of my colleagues here in the room with Charlie's Law and adult stem cell, to what we've done, you and I have done, working with many colleagues in the room like Lee Bratcher and the Blockchain Council with regard to what we're doing in those issues. Unless you study issues thoroughly and you work with stakeholders and you build coalitions and you build consensus, you're not going to have a good product in the end in terms of the legislation that we ultimately pass. The same thing applies to generative AI. We have to be constantly monitoring the quality of the data that's being input in this system, all these systems, for continuous monitoring and improvement. So that's what we're doing with the panel. That's the objective, is to guide us in the future, not just in January, but future sessions. And you start by studying it in a thoughtful way, and that's what we're doing with the panel. Thanks for having me today.
Happy to have you. Well, and Chairman, build off that as much as you like to. One thing I'd love to know, there's a component of the bill, you talked about the council, there's the inventory process as well, and the highlighting of civil liberties. So I'll just kind of tee it up there if there's anything you want to speak to on that.
Absolutely, and thank you all for being here. I think when David started this, he talked about AI being a civilizational issue, and that is, in my opinion, no exaggeration at all. I think when we look at how influential artificial intelligence is going to be in our lives, I don't think we'll have ever seen anything like that. We've all, hopefully, all lived through watching the internet grow and how much that has changed our lives. I think it's going to be several orders of magnitude more on how much artificial intelligence is already influencing decisions that we're making every single day, whether that's the people we see or the meetings that we have, or even the things we learn when we watch the news or read the news as well. At the same time, while I think Texas is obviously the greatest state around in the way that we do things, one of our hindrances is that we meet every 2 years. Okay, so here's this incredible technology that's coming in at rapid pace. Every single day you could go and look at the news, and you can see some new way that artificial intelligence is either being used or misused. In order for us to have the meeting today, we filed a bill in October 2023. Well, we started working on it. And the things that we are working on today, in the meetings that we held today and for a few weeks or a few months, we're going to use to write a bill that hopefully will become effective a year to a year and a half from now. Okay?
It's still faster than D.C.
It's still faster. That's true.
No doubt about that, brother. No doubt about that.
At least we'll get it done. And so what we're doing is we're having these meetings to listen and to learn and to see how it's being used. And if you have a chance to look at our meeting today, we had 4 agencies talk to us and how they're using it and how they're not. Because just as important as how the private sector is going to be using artificial intelligence, I would tell you how the government is using artificial intelligence is also important. We heard from one agency who is already using it on their back-end processing to do invoice. You know, they've hired people to just handle invoices, and they've gone from 2 to 3 weeks to do invoices to 13 seconds, right? It's more accurate, it's faster. We've seen how they're using it for incident management, so that if there's an accident somewhere on 35, they're able to get the tow trucks or whoever needs to get there 5 to 10 minutes faster, which is going to improve all of our lives. We've also heard, though, from some agencies who are going to take a much more cautious approach. Don't know how this is going to work. They've gone online and they've tried it, and it's not right all the time. And in some use cases, it's just too risky to rely on artificial intelligence. When we talk about something which we didn't today, but is on the docket for us to talk about, is how does this affect not just government agents, but your actual civil liberties, right? And you have to look at the ability and how cheap it's going to be for everyone to use it. So let's just take the case of just maybe how you may want to procure health insurance, okay? Right now, you're part of a group, you sign up, maybe you work for a company, and they give it to you. But with the amount of data and information that's out there about your health profile or your family's health profile, you could get your own custom health insurance program, right? Which does sound novel. It might be useful, and you might be compelled to do it. But at the same time, think about all the information that you're giving up to do that. When you think about credit scoring, right? And if you look at the federal statutes, it does allow your lifestyle to be considered in that credit scoring. Again, with all of that information that's there, having maybe government or big companies in control of those algorithms that do that, you face some risks there as well. And I'll also say this, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot as I will look at people even now on their cell phones and reading their news and doing all that kind of stuff. There is unlimited content on this planet. There's just so much. I mean, people talk about TikTok, but you can't even, spend your whole life, you wouldn't hit 0.1% of what's available on TikTok or on the news programs. But yet, if you're on your phone, like other people are, 30, 40 hours a week, you're being given some of that content, specially filtered, specially selected for you and only you. Maybe not the same as for your spouse, and maybe not the same as for your child. What I would tell you is the control of those algorithms controls what you think and who you talk to, and maybe even what you believe. And so those are some of the things higher level that I think we're going to continue to work on through this council.
Great. Well, I mean, Senator Parker very humbly laid out that you two defer to the experts, which you of course do, but also to see lawmakers. And I think this speaks to, I mean, Suhail, you knew just about DC, which of course you're in great company. And I think in Texas, we have to be blessed to recognize the lawmakers we have who are reading up on this and really taking a methodical look at these technologies, because it's a move fast, break things industry. It's easy to get lost in the catastrophization of it all. Now, Dr. Stone, to one of the experts, you're appointed as the ethicist. So I'd love two-pronged question for you. What is the role of the ethicist in this council, and what do you hope the fruit of your labor, your efforts, and interacting with the chairs and other agencies, what do you hope the fruits of the labor will look like for Texans?
First of all, it's an honor to be here, and thank you all for selecting this panel for this session. We are very honored that you are here. My role was probably pretty straightforward. It is to ensure, even though you have already heard from two of my fellow council members who are very ethically centric, but my role by appointment was to ensure that ethics will stay in the forefront of any recommendations, any legislation, any regulation comes forward. But I'm not going to have to wrestle with my council members. Number two, I'm also work for the second largest system of higher education in the state. Though I will say that we are actually more omnipresent because there's not a single county that doesn't have an ag county agent. Oh, that's an A&M system employee. And every sheriff, mayor, county judge is on speed dial with my fellow Vice Chancellor, Nim Kidd. So everyone in the state knows this. But with that said, second perspective, higher education. Because it's very important. AI is very disruptive to higher education. So this allows me to have a voice for higher education. And then number three, very straightforward. How can higher education, our political leaders, and our business leaders work together in the state collaboratively to ensure that Texas is the leader in artificial intelligence, not only in the United States, but across the world.
Amen. And, to consensus building, I want to take a step back, and I perhaps buried the lead in talking about, past lawmaker efforts, Chairman Capriglione on House Bill 4 and data privacy. That is the piece that really makes Texas so effective. It's the collaboration with industry, with great minds across the state. And that is, as far as I've seen, looking at different states, and Suhail will kind of ask you what the lay of the land is nationally, but that's the recipe for success for Texas. So just want to emphasize the importance, the yes and. And I'll actually follow up with you, Dr. Stone. We had talked about the ethical principles that ought to be animating AI. And there's, of course, the sector-specific approach. There's kind of the omnibus broad approach. But right now, where you're at in thinking through this, are there specific principles that help actors to engage with?
So putting on my preaching hat, which of course I have multiple degrees in that area, let me state that the goal ethically is trustworthy AI. And I can give you 15 or different ethical principles. Let me just highlight 5 that will build trustworthy AI. Number 1, Suhail said it, the absence of bias. Unless we know that there's no bias, we won't trust AI. Number 2, there has to be transparency. We have to be able to view how the algorithms and or the large language learning model trainers, how were they used? We have to have transparency. Number 3, there has to be an aspect of security. And I'm going to parse security in 2 parts, privacy and safety. We also have to have the sense of representation. And that is that the data sets that are used accurately represent the views of all citizens in the state. And then I will emphasize the last, to have trustworthy AI, that is contestability and redress. Unless there are civil and criminal penalties associated with anyone who creates or utilizes an AI model, we cannot have trustworthy AI because all of the ethical principles ultimately just become little paper on the wall that are aspirational. But when there is contestability and redress, we can have trustworthy AI.
Amen to that. Amen.
Absolutely.
I'm going to shift gears for a second here so we can bring it back at the end to some of the affirmative, looking forward policy questions. Suhail, one thing in your role you have unique window into is the national discourse as well as international, and then different state houses and their legislative efforts on AI, data privacy, and so on. Can you give us a high level, good, bad, ugly? What's the federal government doing, if anything, on this? What are different states doing? I'll let you take it however you want.
Sure. Well, thanks. Good question. And Texas is leading. First of all, on the privacy issue, even before we start talking about generative AI, in Congress, we've been struggling with trying to implement a comprehensive privacy bill for over 10 years. And we're no closer now than we were from over 10 years ago. And I will say that Senator Cruz is one of the leaders in this effort. And we're still working. But that's why states have been moving out, and Texas is a leader in that. And it's important that states move because, as the senator articulated, things in D.C. are just slow, and they're broken down in many ways, particularly on partisan lines. And if you're waiting for good, thoughtful legislation from Capitol Hill, you might be waiting for a long time. Unfortunately, and we can talk about why that is perhaps in a different session. But when it comes to the regulatory approach, there's a few things that are percolating on the federal and then also on the state that should be highlighted. The first is there is an effort on the privacy piece, and that's important, as Dr. Stone articulated, because we use the term responsible AI, trustworthy AI is a beautiful way of putting it. The only way people are going to use technology, including generative AI, is that they have trust and faith in this technology, that they can put very sensitive personal information into, a query and hope that that is, first of all, not shared or sold to others, and that there is reliable and honest and trustworthy outputs that are brought forth. And that is something that, as a company, we strive to implement, but there needs to be guardrails, as David so articulately stated in his opening statement. There are guardrails, and those guardrails, I will say, just to pause on this issue, is, as David said, there are some on the federal side who are trying to do a blanket, one-size-fits-all approach to this. We don't support that. We think it's too ham-fisted, too broad, because if you're talking about a 10th grader in Plano who's maybe using AI to write a term paper that he's, that's due in the morning and now he's scrambling, that's up to parents, teachers, local, school boards to be involved in on how they want to regulate that type of usage. But if you're talking about AI in the national security space, which is already happening, if you're talking about AI in detecting missile sites in North Korea, there need to be some very strict guardrails put into place because companies like Microsoft and Meta and Google and Amazon who are engaged in, as David so appropriately said, this AI race cannot sell, for example, that technology to an Iran or a North Korea or a Russia or a China. And some of my libertarian friends get a little antsy when we start talking about that, but that's a reality. So in between those types of conversations, there need to be some federal guardrails. Again, if we're talking about AI in our elections, in use in our elections, then again, perhaps there needs to be some guardrails put in place. If you're talking about, very relevant to Texas, AI and the use of the electrical, in managing the electrical grid. Likewise, Texas needs to be very careful about how that AI is being implemented. The chairman mentioned AI and the use of healthcare. There's a tremendous breakthroughs there. You might have seen last week or last month that AI detected cancer in mammograms that physicians missed, right? So we're not just talking about neat term papers or floor speeches. We're talking about life-saving technologies here. But again, if you're talking about insurance or the use of AI by the VA in order to grant or deny health care, there needs to be a human that's there to say, hey, this needs to be taken into consideration. And that's why we always say that you are the pilot, the technology is the co-pilot. You're still in charge. You still need to make a human decision, and whatever entity is using that AI technology, whether it's a government agency or a student in their classroom, you still are on the hook for that technology, and you have to manage that technology. And just as Dr. Stone articulated, there are so many levels there that will give you that confidence that he's exactly right, need to be in place, that will help you use that technology in a very thoughtful, smart, and responsible way. Last thing I'll say, just to answer the question more specifically, while Congress is struggling with these issues, and they've had hearings and working groups and discussions, but no regulation has come forth, which is probably good. Rather be thoughtful and take some time than speedy and get it wrong. The president has put together an executive order. It's the largest executive order in our history, 111 pages, and it's a mixed bag. There are some good things in there about transparency, and there are some, what I would argue, are kind of backdoor ways of regulating that we should, particularly as conservatives, be very careful about. And so that's something that, again, we need to be very careful and monitor. And again, with anything that's coming out of the executive branch, that's not legislation. That's not through the democratic process. And so you as citizens need to be very careful that those types of executive orders, don't just govern and call what's happening for the day, but that, again, legislators like I'm seated with here are the ones that ultimately make the decisions, particularly on the state level, for states on a much more federal basis that will be much more specific to a given state or commonwealth.
Great, and as I joke with our border security team, it was the executive order on artificial intelligence that had the first formal declaration from the Biden administration about immigration, of course, to bring more immigrants into the country. So it really is a catch-all, and that's something, we'll get to the question in a second to Chairman and Senator Parker, that we're seeing there needs to be a focused approach. And at TBPF, the research we're doing, we're looking at sector-specific applications of AI. And when we look at state agencies, I work closely with our Director of Family Policy, and you can imagine a scenario where DPS could use this to great avail on behalf of parents, but then also a concerning one where predictive analytics is determining the likelihood, for example, that a parent will act out against their child before anything even happens. The removal of a child could be contingent upon an AI system that we don't have transparency into. We don't know what it's basing its calculus off of. And those are things that at TBPF we're keeping an eye on. And by way of transitioning to kind of the state level policy approach, we'll start with you, Chairman. Are there any specific agency applications of AI that you're most interested in having unpacked throughout this council, or just that you're researching in what little spare time you may have?
Right. Well, we have some spare time now that the election's over. So, it's been interesting for me, even just today, just hearing how agencies are starting to use it. Some of them use it for a while. We didn't talk too much, so maybe I'll talk about part of what this bill said was to come up with an inventory management, right? Which essentially what we wanted to know is what is being used by our agencies today, how is it being used, what sort of guidelines or guardrails they have right now, and it's know what you have and learn how to improve those things. And so we're going to get the final report on that in about 3 months. And I think that'll be eye-telling to see just how much of it is being used in our agencies and all the really cool ways that it is. I mean, I'm actually looking forward to seeing, we know about chatbots, we know about how some of it's being used, like I said, for HR or for benefits management. So a lot of that is going to be useful. I think for the average user, there's going to be an expectation that the government provides those services the same way as others. And the rate that this is going, it's also going to mean that the state is going to have to change some of its practices, right? We started having a conversation, for instance, today about workforce. How is the workforce in Texas going to change as a result of artificial intelligence being used? So on the one hand, you can see that some jobs will go away, right? That they will be replaced partially or entirely by artificial intelligence. On the other hand, it's probably going to create new jobs that require more sophistication, that maybe gives people more free time to work on other things. So I'm looking forward to see how the state deals with the workforce and on education. But an interesting thing that came out while we were having this conversation is, how many people here use ChatGPT? I'm going to guess. All right, pretty good. Do you say please and thank you? Okay. Please do.
It will remember who doesn't say please and thank you.
It will remember, for sure, and it'll save it forever. And but people use it for a lot of different things right now to do essays, but they're using it also to write resumes, right? So you go and you put in your skills, or maybe you get what the company is looking for, and you go and you say, ChatGPT, hey, come up with my resume. And then you go and forward it to the company, who's probably using a large language model to go and filter through and see what you've put in. And so it's like now computers are looking for jobs with computers, and they're just using you as the in-between. So I don't know. For me, it'll be interesting to see how government deals with those types of issues. And it's just, listen, here's the thing. We cannot stop this, okay? And we don't want to necessarily stop this. We want to put guardrails in for the most obnoxious things that are out there, right? We want to stop deepfakes. We want to stop, child pornography in the way that that's being created right now. Same time, just about anybody can work on this. Any country can work on this. And so I'd rather us be in the lead than another country.
Anything you'd like to add, sector specific or
Sure.
things you're looking at?
Well, a lot of thoughts here to talk about. First of all, you obviously got a pretty good overview.
You said 10 bills, by the way, more than 10 bills, right?
Yeah, that was a conservative number, right, as I said earlier. But look, first of all, when you think about where we are at this point in time, we understand uniquely that Texas is in a position to change policy for the future of the nation on all of these issues dealing with generative AI. And so when Texas leads, the rest of the country will follow, and therefore the world will follow. And it's very important that we do so in a way that protects American interests, Texas interests, and so forth. We talked about these various, just a minute ago, national security related applications for generative AI. Think about all the safety and security issues as we pertain to our border. Think about all the things that we need to do to protect liberty and freedom in this state. Look, we're going to be capturing data at a rate that we never have in all of human history. And so, as we've heard about today, focusing on privacy, focusing on security. The security piece is just absolutely enormous. Security and privacy keep me up the most, worrying about the implications of all of this. And that's why these agencies that we have in Texas, they have to have a higher standard. Government has to have a higher standard, even the private sector, with regard to the ethical considerations of all these matters. And so one of the things I will tell you that we will do on this panel during the course of this year is absolutely come forward with a recommendation with regard to an ethical code of conduct that is specific to Texas. And make no mistake about it, I absolutely want to influence what the rest of the country will do in that regard. And so when I think about applications, you've got the ones I just mentioned dealing with these security issues, foreign policy, all these kinds of things that are very, very serious. You have horrific actors out there that will do terrible things, has been referenced as well. We've got to manage the downside. And so, look, there is a proper role. As conservatives, there's a proper role for regulation in this area. We have to. We talk about workforce. Today we had a great discussion on workforce because you know what? When you're an individual looking for work in this state, and to think that you're going to be exclusively interacting with a generative AI system and not with a human being is horrific to me. You've got to find the balance. And we can't take a one-size-fits-all approach to each agency within Texas government because every agency is different. Today we saw TRS. You know, TRS of the various the various agencies that we saw today, TRS was moving the slowest on this area of application with good reason. When you think about what's at stake with regard to healthcare data, with regard to your financial retirement, all of these issues, we've got to use these tools intelligently on a supplemental basis. So the objective of the committee is to wrap our arms around all of it and to get ahead of it. When I think about the conversation we had today with TxDOT, and I think about the fact that we have an objective in the next couple of decades to be able to get to 0 deaths on Texas highways. Today, someone dies tragically on a Texas highway system every day. And so now that we have the ability to go and look at what traffic patterns are doing all across the state, and for that matter, the country, and be able to take that information to improve current challenges, but at the same time to architect better infrastructure for tomorrow. As we as Texas continue to invest in infrastructure at a faster rate than any other state in the country. Keep in mind, that's what it's all about in the end. The reason why we want to drive ingenuity and creativity is to keep the Texas economic engine alive and well. If we don't keep Texas, Texas, if we don't preserve and protect all of our civil liberties, our rights, and be the home of liberty, religious liberty, freedom to do what you want to do in life, you've got to balance all of those discussions with all of this technology that's coming at us so rapidly. One of the other things that came out today that is very utilitarian, pragmatic, is the topic of procurement. You know, procurement in Texas or in any governmental entity runs very slowly, particularly at the federal level. But here in Texas, we're going to have to embrace a expedited procurement model when it comes to AI specifically to defend and to protect our people when we need to maintain privacy and protections, safeguard security, all these things to make certain that we have real accountability in place with regard to these models. And again, just because we put a model in place in March of 2024 for a particular agency application doesn't mean that you don't need to continuously monitor it to see how it's going to change based on the data that it is collecting in April and May and June and every month thereafter. That continuous monitoring is critical. So there are great opportunities for improved efficiency for Texas government, without question. But I think most of that efficiency gain is with regard to these broad administrative functions, administering unemployment insurance and making certain that the boxes are checked as opposed to taking days and weeks and months. We can do those things in seconds, as you heard Gio talk about earlier. To talk about how we can help people to find jobs in a more effective and meaningful way as the TWC because of this supplemental tool. I mean, these are the exciting opportunities. They're tremendously exciting opportunities that are really all about the blocking and tackling of government. And so that's the journey ahead of us, and that's, at a high level, some of my thoughts of where we are today.
That's great. I have a lot of thoughts, a lot of responses to that. One thing, and then we'll kick over to audience Q&A. You mentioned procurement, and that was a process of local government, state, federal government I didn't know much about before grad school. My capstone project was a city that will not be named, their tech procurement department. When I tell you the most jaw-dropping inefficiencies I have ever seen, we're talking multiple orders of iPads and technology for different city employees. Amen to that. If we can make more efficient processes like that, I think taxpayers would be well served by that. So with that, we will open up to audience Q&A. I'll go ahead. We've got Justin Keener in the front here. We'll start with you, and we got, just come in with a mic behind you.
Thanks, David. And Senator Parker, Chairman Capriglione, we are very thankful that y'all are leading this effort for Texas, especially the approach you're taking. Transparency is what I want to ask about, and this question may be best delivered to Sohail. When OpenAI was first being discussed, there was a lot of talk about transparency. commercialization, everything else, all the development that's happening, it appears that that may or may not be the case anymore. How are you planning to address those concerns for me and probably a lot of people in this room, especially as it relates to civil liberties, things that may affect someone's employment, their due process, their family? So kind of open-ended question for you.
Sure, great question. I'll try to be brief and touch upon, and hopefully it'll be somewhat helpful, because that's a very thoughtful and deep question. First, on the issue of transparency, one of the things that we have put in place that you'll notice when you use Bing, for example, chat, is that when you ask a query, there are footnotes immediately that become apparent. So it's not just a mystery as to how that response was crafted. You can see, okay, this was the Dallas Morning News, this is Wikipedia, this might be, a study at a particular university, whatever it might be. And then you can go back and say, okay, you know what? I don't trust the Dallas Morning News. So go back and ask the question, and please do not use the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Dallas Morning News, and give me another answer, right? So that type of customization, is important, because again, you should not just accept what you're given, right? And you need to kind of look behind, or look underneath the hood, as it were, to see how is that query being responded to and supplied to you. On the other part of the transparency discussion, there is a debate now within the tech community and beyond that as to the actual LLM that I mentioned. Some are saying it should be open source. We don't agree with that, but I want to be transparent with you in saying that there is a conversation for that exact reason. Some are saying it should be open source so that people can check the source code and see what is being put into that to create those algorithms, right? We obviously, as a software company that make our bread and butter by selling software, we can't make it open source, because then the business model gets destroyed, because we're in a company, unlike other companies that sell data of users, we actually sell Excel, PowerPoint, Word, and so we need to be careful about the proprietary nature and protect that property right, but it doesn't mean that we can, again, put in safeguards to make that large language model as transparent as possible, and that gets to the bias issue. What I'll tell you is that I was brought into this whole issue. I was joking before the panel that we started that, despite where I work and me being on this panel today, I'm not a techie by nature. I'm not somebody who runs and tries to get the latest device. I didn't have internet service, for example, until COVID, because when I went home, I liked not to be connected. I've never owned a computer in my life. I still don't. But I like technology. It's just not my end-all, be-all. My thing is, if I can't pour gas in it and kick it, I don't know how to work it, right? But I will say I was brought in at Microsoft in the very beginning, over a year ago, when we were rolling out our technology to test it for bias, right? Because we started hearing the stories about, hey, write a poem about Joe Biden and it'll give you this long, beautiful, gushy poem. Write a poem about Ronald Reagan and it will say, I can't do that, right? Or you saw some of the stories in recent news about other companies and their challenges when it comes to queries. So I was tasked with others at Microsoft to test to make sure that it wasn't doing what it's doing. And now the narrative out there is that you have these San Francisco software engineers that are drinking their lattes, driving their Priuses to work, listening to NPR, and they get to work and they start crafting these algorithms that are super lefty, trying to destroy conservatives. There may be some of that happening. It's not at Microsoft, because what we're trying to do, first of all, is check that if it's happening. But really what the problem is, it's actually worse. And the problem is this: the vast amount of human information that I articulated in my opening statement is leaning left. And the reason for that is, just think about your news sources, right? Just as the Lieutenant Governor articulated at lunch, the left has taken over the news media, right? So if you ask about any news issue today, it's going to give you a left-leaning answer, because the leading news sources out there, the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, Washington Post, are left-leaning, right? If you ask about anything academic, no offense to Dr. Stone, you're going to get a left answer, right? Because most universities out there, I'm sure not the Texas state system, but if you're going to your Harvard, your Yales, your Cal Berkeleys, you're going to get a left answer. So unless you go into the application and say, look, I only want you to rely on Texas Christian. I only want you to rely on Grove City College. I only want you to rely on studies from Hillsdale, and give me something on whatever issue, then it'll craft that answer that'll be much more centrist or much more aligned with your worldview. So again, that human responsibility has to be there. The consumer has to be very careful to know what they're getting, because as the chairman articulated, otherwise these algorithms and the information that's been, not because it's by any evil design, it's because unfortunately the left has taken over the very institutions that provide that narrative on so many issues, and therefore the software, in combing through that informational pool, is going to have a left-leaning narrative. Sorry for the long answer, but it's complicated.
Next question will go gentleman right up here.
Thank you. I feel like I'm back in biblical times, and we're all talking about building the Tower of Babel, and I'm using an instrument that's got an apple with a bite out of it. It's just a real moral question, and this is for you, Dr. Stone. I'm so pleased to see someone who's, classically trained, in ethics, because I saw the documentary, The Social Dilemma, and then a lot of the people that have developed these tools are actually the people who, promoted this video to warn people about, well, wait a minute, we kind of ended up building Frankenstein. That wasn't what we started out. And, do we have to move as fast as we possibly can, or how can we proceed with caution? Because I think that, I have children, and for example, my daughter loved to, on Facebook, it's like, which Game of Thrones character are you most like? And they love answering those, but they're giving up all of their personal identity and information unwittingly. And this is a whole generation, because you go to a restaurant, no one hires a babysitter anymore. You got everybody's kid is on an iPad. So how do we tap the brakes a little bit, and how can we morally be more responsible about, especially about regulating, training to remove the bias? Because we all have bias, but we're blind to our own biases.
I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question directly, but let me give you 3 points which I think are important. Number one, we must recognize that many, not all, many of the AI creators actually are transhumanists. And because of that, they believe that it is possible to create a system, an artificial intelligence system, that can replace or improve mankind. So we need to recognize that. The second thing that we need to recognize is that we as humans are the creators of artificial intelligence. And we have to recognize that artificial intelligence is part of the latent potential within creation. So we don't throw it out. Now I'm going to, because I didn't eat lunch today, so I have at least 1 hour where I can take my state employee hat off and I can put my theologian hat on for my third comment. Anyone who professes to be a Christian need not fear artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence cannot and will not replace mankind as God's sole image bearer, and will not overcome his redemptive plan for mankind.
Amen.
Great question. We'll move to this gentleman. Yeah, great answer, too. Gentleman in the blue suit, yes.
Well, thank you to the whole panel for that very informative discussion. One thing that I've written several articles on and given presentations on echoes the sentiment that Suhail gave earlier, which is AI is a tool. Humans will be the pilot. AI is the co-pilot. And through that whole process, you need the human expertise to be the decision makers. So on a individual level, what skills can we as individuals in our various fields? I'm an attorney at Baker Botts, and a lot of this has been in the AI working group we have there, for instance. So what are the individual skills that we can develop short of very labor-intensive skills like learning Python, for instance, to remain competitive, because AI is not going to replace us, but competitors who can use AI will replace us to remain relevant?
Who wants to take that first? In fact, I'll start from a TBPF perspective because I think this is unique. We operate in the state policy network realm, right? And there's a big push for researchers. How do we incorporate this ethically, responsibly? And we have an internal committee at our organization where we're looking at ways to apply it to our roles ethically, responsibly, and not in the Claudine Gay way where you're, plagiarizing every material you're doing. And what we're finding is that just having familiarity with a lot of the tools, which it sounds like based on your background, what you're doing, you're there, but an encouragement to the folks to understand how these tools operate so you can engage in those discussions. And I like to think of it this way. I went to TCU and I had to take a design class in Adobe, go Frogs, in Adobe Photoshop, and I could not stand that class. It was the hardest class for me. But what I learned is how to communicate with our design team so that the experts who are using it and employing it, I can provide realistic timelines, I can speak their lingo, and that's kind of how we're viewing it internal to TBPF, is finding folks who will specialize in it, how to lean on them as assets. I actually see Laura Carr in the audience, and she's an entrepreneur in Texas who's working on different tools for the text-ledge community to apply AI to, for example, transcriptions on committee hearings. So we see it as a tool to be educated on, to understand the first principles, and then lean on the folks who are really driving it forward entrepreneurially.
Yeah, and the other way to look at it is we've all gone through a lot of technological changes already, right? I mean, if you think about calculators, got rid of some people, but it also afforded people opportunities to spend less time doing the actual calculations, right? So I think what you'll see, at least in the short term, is career progression will be at a higher level, right? You'll be looking more at managerial as opposed to being at the lower level, more about architecture than on the actual programming, for instance. I mean, anybody here could probably program in Python if they had ChatGPT with them now, right? So that part is definitely going to be a harder sell to get into. But how do you put those systems together? How do you know what the customers want? How do you market that to the customers? How do you handle the teams, maybe over different parts of the world all at once? Those are still skills that humans are very good at, but will have to excel even more in order to be able to do it. So I think it'll just make us better and make us go at a higher level than we have been right now.
I want to first double click, to use a tech term, what you said, and that is, I often tell people who have the concern about job displacement, you're not going to lose your job to AI per se, but just as you said, you may lose your job to somebody who knows how to use AI. And I'm proof positive. Trust me, my family would laugh to hear that I'm actually up here talking about technology because I'm not a tech person. You don't have to necessarily learn how to code. You just have to be familiar on how the technology works and how to use it. I'm a big concert person, so when I'm looking for those secret codes on how to buy those tickets early, I use AI to find those codes, right? I don't know what's happening exactly on the back end, but it helps me get those Morgan Wallen tickets early, right? So that's important. And in the law firm context, for example, I worked at a law firm, and I would have to read through those depositions and look for a kernel or a nugget of one statement from one question in several thousand pages, right? Now, what's happening, especially with law firms, they're outsourcing that overseas to people to go through those and say, okay, find the one place where they mention Texas DOT, and then a human will go through it and bill the client for however amount they bill. You can have AI do that now, right? So it takes away, as the chairman says, a lot of the drudgery that we maybe don't want to do, and allow for others to do and engage in the higher level work. But we have to be trained, and one of the things that we're concerned about is that particularly Americans who live in rural America are not left behind, right? So we can't just make this transition willy-nilly. There's often in Silicon Valley the discussion, and I'm sure here in Austin, about, breaking things and being disruptive for the sake of being disruptive. That's not our approach. Our approach is, yes, the technology can be used as a tool or a weapon, as David articulated, but we, as somebody who's putting out that technology, likewise share a responsibility that we make sure that everybody has access to that technology, that they know how to use it responsibly, and it doesn't further divides in our country, including for rural Americans, on access to that technology. We were trying to address it when it came to broadband, and likewise now when it comes to AI usage.
So you can see how all this will translate into all the workforce issues of tomorrow. You think about all of the reskilling and efforts that are ahead, right? Back in 21, I carried the TRUE initiative, which is the Texas Reskilling and Upskilling Initiative. And you think about what we were doing there was trying to line up, if you will, or integrate the needs of businesses with what our vocational and community colleges will be able to provide. And so when you realize that we now have this huge delta coming at us as a state and as a nation to make certain that the employees of today can keep up with the pace of technological advancement. And as to a comment that was made earlier, we're not advocating for it to go faster, faster, faster. We want to tap the brakes whenever we can. We want to do this intelligently, responsibly. But I'm just saying the issues around training the workforce will be exponentially bigger than anything we've seen, I think, probably in 50 or more years. And because of that, we've got to be smart in our policies and how we apply policy. We've got to understand these bias issues, which are enormously important as we train these individuals, if you will, for the future to be able to be using these supplemental tools. But just as Mark shared with you, our focus will be, from the committee's perspective, to make certain that at the end of the day, first principles are first principles. We are focused on our rights and our abilities come from our Creator. And that humanity will continue, with God's grace, to lead this world and not be hijacked by all this machine learning. And so all those things go hand in hand when we talk about workforce, and we talk about how we educate our kids, K through 12, right? Forget higher ed for a minute, K through 12. And the battles that will ensue in the coming years with regard to specifically bias and making certain that we as conservatives are represented. Because we all know that at the end of the day, the greatest way to protect this state, all of us that are freedom-loving, passionate Texans, passionate Americans, we all know that the key to a bright and healthy America is a bright red, strong, healthy, conservative Texas. And we'll do everything in our power to guide the ship in that direction as we go forward, as we are entering this new domain that all of us now are living in here in 2024.
So we're concocting some great legislative ideas just in this discussion. So we have time for one last question, and then we're going to break. We'll go in the very back, right next to you. Yes.
And this is a question for the legislators, basically a follow-up on what you were just talking about. Obviously, the low-hanging fruit in terms of legislative protections on healthcare, defense, energy sectors, I think is easy. But it's the thoughts and minds of our citizens that I think we really need to protect. It's easy to see how debacles like Google's Gemini are obvious. But what I'm more concerned is, do you see an effective way to implement policy to protect more subtle manipulations of political ideas that may be presented to our Texas citizens through generated content by AI?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of ways to look at that, right? So one of the things that we'll look at for sure, and I know other states are when they're looking at possible legislation, is a way to, we could call it transparency, but also a way to audit what's happening, a way to measure the impact, right? So we'd call it, let's say, a data impact assessment or an impact assessment tool. So for instance, if let's say someone or a company or whatever is using a tool, an AI tool, there are ways to measure whether or not the results were biased or prejudiced and so on. And so what we're hoping to do, I think, in the things that we're talking about, at least for very risky situations, is to require those types of assessments, or the way for individuals to be able to go and say, okay, that is treating a certain class of people, or it's doing something that is not the right way. We also have to acknowledge, of course, that there's a difference between private corporations or private entities and government, right? So for the government, it's going to be a lot easier, I think, for us to regulate what those results are and to make sure those are audited. And it might be more challenging, but that's what, I mean, my perspective, and we've had this conversation when it comes to social media content and things like that, is the free market does work too, right? And so if you find that there's a program or a software application or a website that doesn't give you the results that you want, or you feel there's bias, yeah, I mean, it's a free country, right? Don't use that, and I think the market will prevail. But I mean, for at least I think from a policy perspective, we're going to have to focus on that, but we're also going to probably require interesting kinds of regulations. I'll just give you a really quick, maybe quick, but I'll try and make a quick example of how it might work in the political sphere, right? So there's this company called Civox, and Tan and I could go call the company now and probably start using it. And essentially what it does is it can learn how I speak and 150 or 200 words, be able to duplicate my voice. I can go on my website and learn all my messaging. It could go through my voting record, and it could know my record, honestly, better than I know my voting record. And then I can, for a fee, pay it to do robocalls and start calling my constituents, 1,000, 10,000, 50,000 at a time. And they can have a conversation with my AI me in a way that the demo I saw was pretty interesting, right? And it talks just like this. Like you say, well, I'm busy. And then my AI guy will say, oh, I know, but can I just tell you a couple more things, And then you can ask me about, that I voted for the biggest property tax cut in history. And I will be able to answer that. And if you speak to me in Vietnamese, I'll speak to you in Vietnamese, right? And if you speak to me in Spanish, I'll speak to you in Spanish. And so that's important, but at the same time, shouldn't you know that that's not really me? Shouldn't I know what I'm saying to those folks? So there's a lot of work. I mean, we're joking about 10 or 12 bills, but I mean, I'm looking at this, and it seems like, there's got to be ways to do this, but almost every single rule, every single law we have has to take into account a version that was not originally meant for humans.
And with all that being said, look, this is Texas. We're at the TPPF conference, right? We're all about limited government. We're all about free markets. We're all about free enterprise. But I will tell you that in the role that we're in this time and place, that if there was ever a time to look at the necessity of putting in place regulation to address the downside implications for our society, and they are numerous, far too numerous for us to even list today and talk about, we will have to take action. And so I want everyone to understand that, just given the uniqueness of what we're talking about, that it will be different than other domains of creativity and ingenuity and so forth. The other thing that we'll have to do, to answer your question very precisely, is that we'll have to use the muscle and the economic power and strength of Texas as the 8th largest economy in the world to show that we mean business and that there will be a line in the sand, absolutely. And that line in the sand we want to drive as Texans for the nation. That's why that ethics code of conduct is so critical and why Texas must lead. I would argue of all the things before us, as a policy shop, so to speak, as a legislative body, this is at the top of the list because it has such enormous implications for every aspect of our lives. And Texas, therefore, we have a moral responsibility to the rest of America. We have a moral responsibility to 31 million Texans that Gio and I are blessed to represent in the legislature. And Texas will lead for the good of the country and the good of the world. So that's my perspective.
Let's give it up for our panelists. What a great way to end it. Thank you, Senator. By way of housekeeping, I am supposed to remind you all that 4 o'clock, please join us in the Zlotnick Ballroom. We have our border security panel. We knew this is going to be the topic, so it's in the large Zlotnick Ballroom. Please join us for that. And I do want to just put a quick bow on everything that was just said there. We started this conversation talking about the digital frontier, the civilizational implications, and I think that this was a perfect way to kind of bring this conversation to a close, because here we have in Texas folks who are truly committed to the responsible, trustworthy future of artificial intelligence. And I would encourage you all, for folks who are following this, who are interested in it, TPPF will continue to research on it. Please reach out to us if you have any questions. And to all the folks who are here, I hope I speak for you all in saying, please join the AI Advisory Council process. Have your voices heard. Let's get engaged. And we've got some big wins on the horizon for the 89th legislature. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you all for being with us.